All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Taxpayers Association of El Dorado County's candidate forum for District 1 Supervisor. My name is Andy Nevis. I'm the president of the association. For those who don't know, District 1 covers most of El Dorado Hills. Supervisor John Hidahl is running for re-election to his second term and is being challenged by former District 4 Supervisor Ron Briggs. We had hoped to have both candidates here this morning, but at the moment we just have Supervisor Hidahl, so that's what we're going to go with for now. And I should also mention that those two candidates beat out two other candidates in the March primary, so these are the two that got the most votes in that election. We're going to split up the discussion as we have been into three parts. First, we'll hear opening statements from our candidates. Then we'll get some questions that I wrote with some of our Taxpayer Association members. And then finally, we'll hear questions from the audience. Those in the audience can submit questions in one of three ways. If you are in the room here, you have speaker cards that you can write questions on and bring up to me at any time. If you're on Zoom, you can use the chat feature. And finally, if you're online watching on Facebook, go ahead and send them via email to taxpayersedc@gmail.com. Once again, that's taxpayers, plural, EDC, as in El Dorado County, @gmail.com. And that's all lowercase. A note for those watching online, we're doing the best to get you the best audio quality we can. We are in a restaurant, so there is going to be some background noise. While we've taken the steps that we can, we do encourage you, you may want to turn up the volume on your device to get the best results. And if you are watching on Zoom especially, please let me know if the audio somehow suddenly cuts out. I would really appreciate knowing that so that we can fix that as soon as possible. A reminder, obviously this is not a debate since we only have one candidate here. Because of that, the questions must not be directed at a specific individual, and personal questions are not going to be allowed. I would also encourage the candidate to avoid any personal attacks.
Okay, I agree.
While recognizing, while recognizing, of course, there's important differences between you and your fellow candidates. And so with that, we're going to start the same way we do every Taxpayer Association meeting. All rise, remove your covers, and we're going to say the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Since we only have one candidate, I'm going to make an executive decision that we're not going to do timed questions and answers today, just because that's a little bit of a pain to do, and I think you know how to keep it short. Supervisor Hidahl, if it does become a problem though, and I feel like it's getting too long-winded, I'll just tap on my gavel here and ask you to wrap it up so we can get on to the next question.
Okay.
Since we do only have one candidate here, we do have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So please don't be shy, and go ahead and send that over to me. So with that, we'll get started with the opening statement. So normally this would be about 3 minutes. Again, we're not going to time it today, but go ahead, Supervisor Hidahl. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm John Hidahl. I've been a resident of El Dorado County since 1978, and in El Dorado Hills all those 42 years. I worked at Aerojet many years ago, which is the reason I came to this area for the Central Valley. My wife Eileen and I have 5 daughters, and we have 10 grandkids, so we're very proud of that. I was able to celebrate my birthday this last weekend, just yesterday, and had the grandkids around, and what a joy that is to see our youth growing up. My oldest grandson is 16, and my youngest grandson is 1. So pretty good spread in there, right? But a lot of fun. So I'm running for re-election primarily because I'm very pleased with the progress that El Dorado County has made in what I'll call culture change over the last 4 years. When I got into office, there was the typical bureaucracy way of doing things. It takes as long as it takes, and it's going to cost whatever it costs. And I'm pleased to say that I've actually seen a transition over the last 4 years, and it's gradual. It's not, immediate, incremental, but I owe a lot of that, I think, to the credit to Don Ashton, our CAO, who's just done a marvelous job, in my opinion, in terms of organizing the way the county operates and being very diligent, looking at our processes. And we're doing a lot more metrics these days. So we have dashboards and other things as indicators of performance, which are basically emulating what private practice has been doing for well over 20 years. So I have a unique set of qualifications, having worked at Aerojet for 31 years as a rocket scientist and 10 years at Northrop Grumman as a top secret surveillance engineer, looking at platforms that were flying over foreign countries to acquire signal intelligence data. So with that background and a lot of process history and training, bringing that to El Dorado County is what I'm trying to do. And I'd like to see another 4 years to be able to complete this task.
All right, so now we'll get into the question and answers. Again, I have a few to start, but please, if you have questions in the audience, keep them coming. So the first question is the same one that I asked the District 2 candidates last week, but I think it's really important for anybody who's running for supervisor to consider. This county CAO has often said that El Dorado County cannot be small and rural with low taxes and high levels of service. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, which of the three would you prioritize as most important and which is least important?
I would say he's pretty much accurate with that statement, because what you find if you compare or contrast El Dorado County with Placer County is that Placer County has, I think it's in the neighborhood of 11 incorporated cities or towns. And what people need to recognize is out of the property taxes base and other taxes that the county receives, there's a portion of it from the state government set aside for cities and a portion of it set aside for counties. So if you have a large number of cities, in addition to the county, you're going to bring more revenues to that general area within the whole county. So Placer County is very fortunate in having a number of fairly large cities, and they brought additional tax base to the cities. When we have a rural county like we do, we don't get that same benefit. So we don't have as much money for road maintenance. We don't have as much money for the health and human services part of the delivery system. So there's a lot of things that being rural takes away from the ability to fund services. That said, having a rural part of our county, I think, is very important. That's been our heritage, it's been our history, and we need to maintain a rural part of the county. But I don't see how the whole county can be rural and still survive. We have to have an economic engine. We have to continue to fund new revenue streams. And I think we need to encourage jobs within our county, particularly for our youth. And the way we do that is by bringing good businesses to El Dorado County. 85% of the growth that's happened in the county in the last 5 years has happened in El Dorado Hills. That should be no surprise to anyone with all the specific plans that were approved in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where housing was approved. The thing that we've not been able to achieve is the jobs to housing ratio. We failed miserably as a county to bring jobs into this area. So we have to double down on that. We have to look at the economic development portion of it. There's a lot of conversion going on in the business park right now to look at what was R&D ground and industrial zoning and convert that to mixed use, which would be both commercial and residential. And to me, that's an opportunity to bring workforce housing, affordable housing, right within the work centers that are adjacent or immediately available within the business park. So those are things that I think make a lot of sense. As long as we handle the traffic situation, we got to make sure we have adequate roads. We need to make capital improvements in those. The developers need to pay for that portion of it that they're accountable for. And if we do that, I think we can have a continuing healthy economy in El Dorado County. Obviously, COVID has been a major setback. A lot of businesses are really struggling. And I've heard numbers that probably half or better of the businesses that are struggling will not survive, this next round. And the funding from the federal government that we were hoping for doesn't look like it's going to happen quick enough to help in a lot of areas. Even the airlines are struggling. Yeah. So all those things together. So yes, we can have, I think, a very service-oriented county, but road maintenance is always going to be the number one issue I think we deal with in terms of, do we have enough money?
All right. So kind of related to that, many El Dorado Hills residents, including Mr. Steve Ferry, who's on with us on Zoom this morning. Shout out to Steve. Many El Dorado Hills residents do not believe that they get their fair share of county services. How will you ensure that El Dorado Hills gets its fair share? And do you support efforts to incorporate El Dorado Hills?
So fair share, I'm sure, goes back to property tax base contributed per district as opposed to immediate services provided. And I do think we get close to our fair share. The one area I do think we're not getting as much attention and help as we need is in the law enforcement phase, and particularly when it comes to motor vehicles type violations. And that's the responsibility of our CHP. So we have a lot of issues with people running red lights, stop signs, speeding in the residential communities. There's a lot of accidents. There's just a lot of things that are happening with motor vehicles that, unfortunately, there's just not enough CHP officers to do that enforcement. I don't know the distribution of our sheriff's deputies within El Dorado Hills versus other areas because it's changing all the time, and I think that dynamic is good. The sheriff is focused on looking at where the hot spots are across the county and focusing resources at those hot spots as opposed to a standard patrolling type of process. I think that's all good. But law enforcement would definitely help. We've had issues recently up in Calathea Park and Heaven of trying to get enough law enforcement to prevent people coming from outside of the area from abusing our parks and our areas. We had a fire down there. It was obviously set by somebody that could have been very devastating to residences and stuff. Fortunately, our fire department was on top of it, got it put out. We had gunshots into a home down in El Dorado Hills from, I guess it was Heaven that the firing went through the front window and could have killed somebody, but fortunately didn't. Those are the things we're starting to see. So there is a concern with, do we have enough law enforcement? And that's a tough thing because they can't be everywhere. So I think we're doing well, but there's a continuing need there.
So turning now to the COVID pandemic, it's a little bit of a two-part question. First of all, do you believe that county staff should be playing a role in enforcing Governor Newsom's restrictions? And second, if, as has been threatened, tomorrow the state moves El Dorado County into the more restrictive red tier of restrictions, how should the county respond?
Okay, well, with respect to the first one, I do believe the county has a responsibility to react to areas where there's flagrant, I'll call it, lack of complying with the governor's regulations. And that's primarily because in order to keep people safe, we need to wear masks and be socially distanced to the best of our ability. And that's not necessarily to keep you safe, it's to keep others safe. We have a very vulnerable population in terms of a lot of our seniors, people with morbidities. They're the ones that are highest risk to have severe complications with COVID and obviously death at some point. So we need to protect those that are vulnerable. In order to do that, I don't think you can allow flagrant disobedience without trying to coach and teach and help them understand the need for just some minimal constraints. So that's that part of it. With respect to changing back, there's a lot of discussion now going on with the governor about trying to get him to give more authority to the rural counties to self-operate. I'm a strong proponent of that. I think we've come along and done our job, and we should be given the authority to control what we do in El Dorado County separate from the governor's oversight. But that's something he would have to agree to. So going backwards is never good, and I don't know how we're going to deal with that. I just don't think that's practical. I think people will react no matter what, and it's not going to be productive when it's all said and done. But we have the ability to be self-governed. We need to have that ability. Local government is the best government. We don't need the state overseeing us at this point, right? We've responded. We've flattened the curve. We're on a recovery mode. We should have the authority to deal with our own issues in this county.
All right. So I just want to pause attention because I can see the folks, maybe some folks on Facebook are already going to point this out. John is sitting at least 6 feet away from me, and I'm wearing a mask, and the entire rest of the room is many, many more feet away than that. So anyway, I just wanted not to make any judgment statement on that, but because I knew somebody on Facebook would point that out, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
So you've, this originally said you've both served as county supervisors, but you've served as a county supervisor. Part of a supervisor's role is ensuring that county staff are responsive to the needs of your constituents. Without getting too far into personal details, if you can't, please describe an instance where you were able to intervene with county staff to secure a good outcome for your constituents.
Okay, let me start by saying part of this cultural transformation at the county has included 360 performance reviews. I was a key part in implementing that. So we now get feedback on all of our department managers who are appointed department managers. We provide goals. We look at the customer service part of it. Are they meeting the needs of their customers? Are there a lot of complaints? And if there are a lot of complaints in a given department, then we'll put that into a goals. You know, take the activity necessary, training, whatever it is, to reduce the number of complaints you're getting. So the area that I get most of the calls from is two areas. I guess it's really two areas. One is traffic situations, and that's usually road maintenance related. And those I immediately contact Department of Transportation, work with the director to determine if there's some mitigation, some response we can put in place to try to fix those kinds of pothole situations or whatever they may be. And the other area is in land use. And we have an awful lot of people who are trying to get either approval to run a business out of the business part, to get the licensing, the permitting that's done. We've had people that have been stressed from the standpoint of trying to take care of an elderly parent living out of a tiny home and not being able to get a permit because the county doesn't allow them on an emergency basis to get a permit. So we're modifying all those things. Right now, we're going through a process to put into place an emergency ordinance that would allow permitting for hardship and special cases, a lot of which are COVID related. We don't want to see more homeless people in this county. We want to try to keep people in housing as opposed to increasing the homelessness. So that's the bigger picture part of it. Okay.
So this is my my last question before we go to the audience questions, and we already have several, but I always would welcome more. Again, there's a few ways you can do that in the room. You have cards. On Zoom, you can type in the chat box, and if you're on Facebook, please use taxpayersedc@gmail.com. I'd encourage you to do that instead of putting it in the comment section on Facebook, because last week I found that for some reason the comments on Facebook didn't necessarily come through on a timely manner. So the best way to make sure that I see them here is to put them through the email. That said, so the last question that is pre-scripted is, it's going to take you back to government class a little bit, but I think it's hopefully a revealing question. Political scientists describe two different models for elected official decision making. One model, the delegate model, says that elected officials should follow the wishes of their constituents, even if they themselves don't believe it's actually in their constituents' best interest. The other model, the trustee model, says that elected officials should follow what they believe to be in the best interest of their constituents, even if that is deeply unpopular. While recognizing that no elected official adheres to one or the other all of the time, which do you think that you lean towards more in your decision making, and why?
I'd say it's a combination, because I always want to hear from the delegate type of perspective what people are thinking and what they're seeing. What I found is a lot of people have a very one-sided view of a given situation. They have not had the ability to see the other side of it. A lot of that ends up being presented to us in closed session. And so there's a lot of things that I can't discuss that come up in a situation with closed session briefings that present another side of the story, which is substantially in opposition to what the public may think, right? So there's those kinds of things you have to deal with. From the trustee perspective, when I was on the fire department board of directors in El Dorado Hills, a lot of things were discussed. Do we need to put this on the ballot? And majority of people came back and said, no, we elected you to make those decisions. We don't have enough information, enough visibility, enough history to make things. So it's really a combination. It's a case by case thing, but I'm always a believer you start by listening to everybody and then try to look at what's in the greater good. And it's not just for El Dorado Hills. It's not just for District 1. It has to be the whole county. So vegetation management ordinance is a prime example, right? El Dorado Hills had a pretty good system working with the El Dorado Hills Fire Department in terms of vacant lot ordinance. That cleaned up a lot of the issues that El Dorado Hills had for many, many years, but just spread that across the county as an initial really effort to try to make sure that people have defensible space. And you get a lot of feedback that you're just trying to push government at people, and that's not what we're doing. We're trying to help people be safer Because if your property is safer from fire, your neighbor's property is going to be safer for fire. So it's a hard reality of where we are in California, but that's just an example of the things where you really have to look at the total picture and make sure that you're trying to serve the greater good in this circumstance.
All right. So now we're going to get into some audience questions. I did look through the ones that we weren't able to get to last week with the District 2 candidates. And I put a few of those in here to begin with because I thought they were really good questions. And
okay.
Ken and George lucked out, so you get to answer them instead.
All right.
But this first one is from Gay. She asks, "What is your opinion on law enforcement funding? And do you believe social services should receive funding from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office?"
Law enforcement is all important. We need to maintain our law enforcement, if not increase it. One of the difficulties we had is the sheriff has had a difficult time recruiting people. So the Board of Supervisors actually funds positions that the sheriff is unable to fill. And that ends up being a lot of the fund balance at the end of the year in terms of carryover. Social workers are never going to replace law enforcement agents. There are situations where a PERT team, a psychiatric emergency response team, it's important to have law enforcement there and a clinician to be able to assess the mental health of an individual and to be able to properly treat them or to direct them to the proper services, depending on what it is. The worst thing you can do, in my opinion, is take somebody with mental illness and throw them in jail. That doesn't accomplish a whole lot. You really have to try to understand what is their story. What are they struggling with? Are they on meds or not? Is there assistance that can be done there? So yeah, we need to continue to fund the Blue. We need to make sure that our law enforcement is strong and responsive. And social workers will never replace law enforcement. They have a role, but it's a lesser role than law enforcement when it comes to civil disobedience and those kinds of situations.
All right. So this came in on a card last week, so I don't know who to attribute it to unless somebody's going to claim it. As a supervisor, who would you work with a developer to reduce permit costs to provide affordable housing?
Yes, provided they are a qualified affordable housing producer, right? So what you find with the lower end of affordable housing for very low and low income people, is that there's a select group of builders who have the knowledge of how to get grant monies, the pre-qualifications, et cetera. And in order to enable affordable housing for that very low income level, you have to work with those people if you're going to try to provide that kind of housing. So yeah, in fact, there's a number of projects that I've been supportive of that have started down that path. Federated Church has a property that they're working with Mercy. You know, and people can argue it's in the wrong location, but when you look at where's the right location, I think it's a good location for that type of service. And I think we're going to see a net benefit to the community of having some of that affordable housing provided. But that has to be done by special builders, not just any developer.
All right. And then going into transportation, Chris Payne asks, what is the county travel demand model? If you could give kind of a quick summary of that. I know it came up at the supervisors meeting recently. And how is it important to the future of the county?
Okay, the travel demand model is basically an analytical tool that's programmed to try to address the normal traffic flows that occur in a given section of road or intersection. So there's two major parts that TDM looks at. Road segments in terms of, and it's based upon level of service primarily, but now we're migrating into VMT considerations as well. So it's level of service. What capacity does the roadway have as opposed to the demand? Is there excess capacity? Is there not enough capacity, et cetera? And then the other is intersections. And the intersections are movements, right? I mean, left turns, right turns, signalization, all those kinds of things. Because you can afford higher traffic flows if you do sequence type of intersections. One of the things we're looking at on El Dorado Boulevard is what they call an ATS system. It's a series of cameras that looks at what the demand is coming at a multitude of different stoplights, and then will trigger the flow through a given intersection to time it to get the demand. So the example I always like to use is it's Sunday morning, church just let out, and you got 150 cars coming at you in one direction and nobody coming at you from the other direction, right? This isn't going to force all those 150 cars to go through multiple light changes. It's just going to give them a green and hold any car that happens to come up the intersection until that's cleared. So it's caravanning type of purposes to get people through intersections. So those are very important things in terms of how we manage that part.
Okay. So again, sticking with transportation, this question came in from Ray Myers. He is asking about job order contracting. And for the audience, job order contracting is a method of contracting which allows agencies to enter into a master contract for ongoing maintenance and minor construction projects for a specific period of time or maximum dollar amount, rather than bidding each project individually. So he asked, do you think the Department of Transportation should utilize the job order contracting method?
Yes, they should. You can't use it on every project. So it's generally the smaller projects. I've encouraged DOT to look at that. And the county as a whole uses job order contracting in a number of different provisions. Our procurement organization uses that for certain types of work activities, facilities work, that type of thing. DOT has not been as active in using those particular contracting methods. But I think with continued encouragement and looking at things, we will see some more JOC type contracts coming out of DOT. But ultimately, they have to decide what they think is the preferred way to do that. And again, JOC is pretty much smaller jobs, but there are opportunities for cost reduction, savings, if you will, by using JOC versus the bid process. So it should be a JOC versus a bid decision, bid, no bid type decision. So
all right.
We don't have that today, but hopefully we're moving towards that.
All right. So a question from one of the cards here. The question is, would you stop the use of the consent calendar? I think I would, I'll take a little liberty and say, what do you think is appropriate to be on this consent calendar, and what should come before the board to?
Okay. No, I don't think we should stop the use of the consent calendar. We'd have 24-hour meetings because the consent calendar is intended to address things that are repetitive, things that we have well-established provisions on. It may be a renewal of a contract, it may be an extension, it may be accepting funding from the federal government, a number of things that to the average person looking at it would say, who's interested in that? Now, it turns out that there's a lot of things that end up on consent calendars that a very limited number of people are generally interested in. But the provision to pull something off the consent calendar is always there. And either the board member who feels like they need to have more dialogue or more information can pull it off consent, or at the request of the public, an item can be pulled off of consent by the board or a board member. So it only takes a single board member to pull something off the consent and have the discussion. And most of the time, it's clarification things that I've seen pulled off of consent, where there just isn't enough information provided on Legistar to give people a full understanding of the background, the history of some of these things. And with a little bit of dialogue, that's better understood, and then you can move forward. But yeah, the consent calendar is an efficiency method to try to make sure that you streamline meetings and don't wear everybody out for just long hours of discussion on things that have very little importance to most people.
All right. So I'm going to go to an emailed question now. This is from Jennifer Yoder. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Jennifer. She asks, although it is not a mandate, are you in favor of the creation of an oversight commission for the Sheriff's Department under AB 1185 that was recently signed by Gavin Newsom? If so, do you think it's important to appoint commissioners with a law enforcement background?
I have not heard the sheriff weigh on this. In general, I don't think an oversight committee for our law enforcement in El Dorado County, I'll say, is the appropriate tool. I can understand how in various communities there is a lot of concern with the degree to which the law enforcement has somewhat of a siloed activity without the public knowing largely what's going on, what kind of training is going on. I don't have that sense in El Dorado County to the same extent. So I would say I'm mixed on that until I hear from the sheriff what his thoughts are. Generally, oversight committees on law enforcement, it would take commissioners who have a law enforcement background. If you don't have a law enforcement background, I don't know how you could adequately determine the appropriateness of any given actions that are taken. So the sheriff is an elected official, and with his elected status, he has the ability to determine how he runs his department. If it isn't broken, let's don't create something new, but our governor is always looking at things that I think probably provide too much government oversight as opposed to healthy ways of making sure that funding in particular is properly managed. We can do that other ways.
All right. So this one is another one from the cards, and it's a little bit personal, but I think it's on the fence enough that I'll allow it.
Okay.
I'll probably tweak it a little bit.
But I can disallow it if I want.
If you want to, but then the voters can react accordingly. It says, but it's referring to the Charter Review Commission. It says,
Okay.
During the 5-year El Dorado County Charter Review in 2017, you advocated for no term limits for supervisors, and a measure was placed on the ballot which would have extended the term limit from 2 terms to 3 terms, and it was defeated 2-1. This questioner is interested in a little bit more of your reasoning for why term limits for supervisors are not a good idea.
What I've experienced through CSAC primarily, which is the California State Association of Counties, is that most counties do not have term limits. And I have encountered several supervisors that have been in their positions for 16, 20 years, similar to our elected officials in other organizations like the auditor controller, the assessor, similar to those. So it's interesting to me that supervisors can only serve 2 terms, but other elected officials in this county can serve unlimited terms. So it seems like there's a disparity there. I don't quite understand why, but there is. So from the standpoint of representation, what you find in things like CSAC is the people who are really the leaders at the state level and are most influential on our governor are people who've been in office for 12 or more years. They've got the history, they've got the reputation, they've got the relationship with given people to make things happen. We shortchange ourselves in those kinds of discussions. So should we be a player at the state level? Maybe not. Should we be a player at the RCRC level? Yeah, I think so. And so I think we're underrepresented at RCRC because of those kinds of things as well, because having the history, the knowledge of it really helps you determine alternatives in terms of direction for rural counties to go as opposed to a highly populous county. So that's primarily the reason I looked at it from the perspective of, I'm not sure term limits are great. When the conclusion came down and went on the ballot to extend it to 3 terms, that made sense to me. Let's do it incrementally and see how it works. So.
Okay. So this question is from Jim Lemire, who's watching on Zoom. He's asking, with all of the important issues, fire problems do not appear to be being addressed. Property owner costs are going up yearly. What do you think is El Dorado County's role in addressing improved fire protection in obtaining relief for fire insurance costs?
Okay, there's a couple of things packed into that. So with respect to vegetation management, which is to me the defensible space aspect of this, that has to be done in this county if we're going to have a lower threat level, if we're going to have a lower risk of having major fires, and it is a costly proposition. But the way the county is approaching it is we're not saying overnight everybody has to be 100% compliant. We're trying to work with the residents to determine what is the most susceptible, highest threat you have. And sometimes that's just clearing the pine needles off the roof. And that's not a difficult task if you can get some help to do that, right? Sometimes it's having to remove dead trees that are within 100 feet of the homestead or the home. So there's a lot of things that can be done without having major costs. There are some things that require major costs, but in those situations, we're looking to try to use grant monies and or our fire safe councils to assist with those particular activities. So that's it from a defensible space perspective. With respect to the normal things that happen for any property owner, there's a lot of things that need to be continually maintained, roadways, and part of that is the vegetation along the roadways, the right-of-way that the county has to do. We're just now talking about what are we going to do next season for that, and we're talking about pre-emergent type of sprays, hopefully as environmentally compatible as we can find them. But that's the way you economically reduce the weed load and reduce the risk of fires. Probably have to contract out for that, in my opinion, because we don't have that equipment, but I think that's a reasonable provision. And the county very shortly will be able to announce that we've found a method of funding that I think is reasonable and equitable. And so as those discussions come forward, it'll determine it's not going to come from any additional payments by taxpayers. So that's hopefully the solution we find, that we're able to do the additional DOT type road maintenance without having to ask for any more money.
Okay. So this question comes from Sita Burgess.
Mhm.
I know you know Sita, for full disclosure for the audience, Sita is running for El Dorado Hills CFD. So she asked a question relevant to that role,
Mhm.
potentially. Are you in favor of El Dorado Hills CSD purchasing the golf course rather than voting to rezone it for residential property?
Absolutely. That property, and people need to understand when we talk about Central El Dorado Hills specific plan, that's 326 acres. The golf course is 98 acres. So the central project is not just the golf course. People tend to lose track of that. So when you say, are you going to vote for or against it? It's a big project. It isn't just a golf course. But that said, the 98 acres Old Executive Golf Course is basically a land use that's open space, but under our zoning is high use recreational. What I would like to see is that property maintained for high use recreational. I don't think a golf course is appropriate at this point because all the studies have been done says it won't pencil from the standpoint of being economically viable. But if we can create a recreation-based facility there, 98 acres, then I think that meets the needs of the community because we're always needing more soccer fields and baseball fields and girls lacrosse and you name it, because we don't have enough sports fields in El Dorado Hills to meet the demand of our kids and the adults. Pickleball has become very popular with adults. We don't have enough pickleball facilities, right? So the CSD is trying to implement some of those things. It would be the ideal world, in my opinion, if the CSD could purchase all 98 acres, then the community owns it. The community can determine over time how to fund the improvements, which would probably be a bond measure, but it's going to well serve the additional 25,000 people that are expected within the El Dorado Hills area probably over the next 30 years. So those are all things that are important. If they're only able to purchase a part of the 98 acres, I would hope that the remainder piece of that 98 acre piece were used for other recreational purposes. There's been discussions of facilities like a Topgolf possibly being brought in. And I'm not necessarily a fan or not a fan because I've never been to a Topgolf. But there are facilities like that that might be attractive to some people. And I think, the right mix of things could make that a very viable recreation-oriented piece of ground. The 98 acres of recreation right there in the heart of El Dorado Hills.
All right. So we haven't talked much about CalPERS in either of these two forums, but it's something we really should.
Why start now? It's not a pretty story. Bring Joe Harn in.
This question is, would you revisit our retirement program and CalPERS unfunded liability going forward?
Yes, if the state is going to allow us to do that. Obviously, CalPERS has pretty much got to be a state initiative, in my opinion, to try to reform the existing levels. CalPERS actually has 3 different levels now. There's the classic, there's kind of the mid-classic, and then there's the latest, which is a lower set of benefits to the employee. So I hate the thought of going back with people who in the classic, for instance, that are already receiving their pensions and saying, okay, we're going to reform this and cut your income down for your retirement by 25% or something rather arbitrarily. It just doesn't make sense to me to take away from people's expectations that paid into the system and had this expectation. It's kind of like Social Security, all right? When I contributed to Social Security, as many of us did, we expected to be able to use those benefits in our retirement years. Yet there's always a threat that Social Security isn't going to be funded and it could go away. So it's just not right to take away retirement benefits from people who earned it and have that expectation. But over time, there will be changes in CalPERS, but in my opinion, not quick enough. So it's going to be a continuing struggle for the next 20 years in terms of unfunded liability.
All right. So sticking to fiscal employee-related issues, would you cut back on contracting out?
I would cut back on certain types of contracting out, and I would increase other types of contracting out. I think the key provision is you have to look at what I'll call a make-buy. My private sector experience was always in terms of proposing work. We sat down and did a make-buy. We determined what are our internal capabilities and what can we do quickly and what can the outside supplier provide, and are they reliable enough to deliver on time? Is their customer service aspects of things going to be okay? Do they have the ratings for that? And I would say that probably 60% of the time in those decisions I was involved in, it was a buy decision, because the costs of doing business for a private enterprise oftentimes exceeds what it is for an outside contractor who can keep their costs lower because they don't have all the overhead of facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the situation with Aerojet, at least. So there is a process we need to put in place to try to determine what is the best value for the taxpayers in terms of getting work done. There's certain contracts we have, I think, we way overpaid for what was delivered. We got a bunch of paper. And I'll just use the signed ordinance as an example. We got a whole lot of paper, but the signed ordinance isn't a very good document, in my opinion. It's very difficult to understand. We streamlined to probably at least 20% of the content that's in there. So those kinds of things, we need to be cautious what we contract out, make sure the deliverable is exactly what we want and not just a bunch of words, right?
Yes. So this question, as I've done with a few of these, I'm going to, just out of transparency, I'll read the question as it was submitted, and then I'll invite you to maybe take it in a little bit more of a broader sphere, just so it's a more insightful discussion. But I will read the question. All elected officials are required to sign an oath to protect and support the state and national constitution.
Mm-hmm.
If you are elected, will you sign a constitutional affidavit that essentially says that if it is proven that you violated your oath of office, then you will immediately resign and/or allow the people to remove you from office without your protest or objection? What I'm going to invite you to do is just, reflect on, since you already have been a supervisor, reflect on taking the oath of office. What does that oath mean to you? And how does it guide, your everyday operation as a supervisor?
Well, to me, the oath of office is an extremely important part because it's basically taking an oath of allegiance to our national government and our state government through the constitutions. The difficulty as a supervisor that I've experienced is oftentimes what people perceive as being the overriding condition, which would be the national set of laws, our state or federal constitution, versus the state constitution under emergency orders. There is disparity, and what I don't think is widely recognized is every state constitution is different. Every state governor has a different level of authority based upon what's been vested in them through emergency order provisions. And the federal government obviously has its authority, but where you end up with conflicts between a state and a federal type situation, they usually get settled in court. And I've been very surprised in California, probably a majority of those settlements went in favor of our governor as opposed to the national, federal government. So again, I'm not a legal expert. I try to read the stuff and understand it as best I can. But when things come to court decisions, sometimes they seem to go a different direction than what you would have thought. You would think that the federal constitution would always prevail, but it turns out it doesn't always prevail. So that's a kind of a guarded thing. With respect to the oath, I guess the question comes up, what does it mean by it's proven? Does that mean a grand jury? Does it mean a vote of the people, which is the proper way to take people out of office, is a recall? If they're not doing their job, recall them, right? So the proven part is the only question I have. I would certainly be willing to step down if it was proven by a grand jury or whatever that my actions were not appropriate.
John, answer the question
nope.
directly. Is that a yes or no? Will you voluntarily sign a constitutional oath of office?
Yeah. Good. All right. So Chris Payne writes in. He's in Mill Valley today. He put in his question, so that's his excused absence for the day. But anyway, he's visiting his granddaughters down there.
Oh, good.
Marin County is dealing with producing and locating affordable housing. Marin is a more expensive place to live, somewhat like District 1. He asks you, what is affordable housing and where should it be located in El Dorado County and more specifically in District 1?
So affordable housing is a multitude of categories of housing. If you look at the state RENA numbers, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment that comes out, they put categories of housing from very low to moderate income and above moderate income. There's basically 4 categories, of which the bottom 3 are the ones that the state looks at trying to establish allocations. In our case, our allocation comes through SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. So they're looking at the state requirement, and then they look at SACOG, which is, I think, 6 counties and maybe 12, 15 cities in terms of the distribution of affordable housing needed through that area. And so El Dorado County gets an allocation of that, comes from SACOG. So our job then is to look at where do we put that affordable housing? How do we at least plan for it? And as a result of it, we have an inventory of property that's been defined that identifies where affordable housing can be located within El Dorado County. And most of these end up being multifamily apartment complex type sites. So it's a multifamily type of zoning. And if we find that there isn't enough property to address the required need for affordable housing, then the county can decide to initiate rezoning of certain types of property. So that's always a provision, but the affordability part of it really comes down to, at a given income level, what can you afford in either monthly rents or in terms of a mortgage payment? So there's numbers that are available for each of the categories we have within RENA that defines that. With respect to where do affordable housing go, it should go in those areas which have enough infrastructure to make it sense. They should go in areas where we have hopefully the ability to provide transit service, so that you have a bus route that would come by and pick people up and move them from place to place as necessary. Within El Dorado Hills, the affordable housing I think that makes sense is the moderate income affordable housing, and that's the workforce housing I'm talking about within the business park area primarily, and hopefully other areas. Because those homes, if you do it right, you're going to be down in the 350 to 400,000 type mortgage payment on something you can own. It's going to be small, and it's going to be probably in the neighborhood of 12, 14, 16, whatever dwelling units per acre. But those are the kinds of densities that some of the recent conceptual proposals have been for the projects down in the business park. So there'll be 3 of those that are being processed. 2 of them gone through a J6 review. The third one is going to go through a J6 review. But I would encourage, the residents of El Dorado Hills and anywhere in the county to comment on it. Does that make sense? Because to me, the key thing is being able to provide housing and being able to attract businesses for jobs. It's not getting the housing in place. It's how do you make sure that the housing that is available for people to not have to commute out of Sacramento County to come to work in El Dorado County.
All right, so we got about 3 questions left, and I think we're going to get to just about every question, excluding, there were a few questions that were essentially identical. So we've already covered those, but I think we just have a few left. So Chris Payne also asks, El Dorado Hills has village designations. These designations go back to the original development. Do they matter anymore? Is there a community importance to those designations? And what community in El Dorado Hills, what is community in El Dorado Hills and its diversity?
So I believe that community identity in the villages is still important in El Dorado Hills. But what you find is that identity associated with a village name has diminished over the last 25 years. When El Dorado Hills got started in the 1960s, it was a village concept, the Gruen plan. And so every one of the villages initially built was built on the idea that was somewhat self-centered, that there were multiple points of ingress and egress, and that those residences would be identified as being part of that village. So Park Village, Crown Village, St. Andrews Village, many other Marina Village. Many of the villages that got started in the early years have their own self-identity, which I think people understand and aspire to, because it's a sense of ownership of a given area. Lake Forest is an area that includes many villages, but it's a Lake Forest region. So I'm in favor of those kinds of things, but as we see the developments come along, they tend to get a name that doesn't have village associated with it, but they really are a separate subdivision. I mean, I don't know very many people call Serrano Village, right? It's Serrano. So the identity thing is diminished, but I think for those of us who understand the heritage and the history of how El Dorado Hills got started, we still like the village title, because I think it's a sense of community that isn't overblown, over-densified housing. It is more of a natural village type of setting where you have some space in between homes and people get together and have block parties and those kinds of things. So that mindset still exists in El Dorado Hills and several areas. I think it should be preserved.
So we got a question from Dean Smith, who lives in El Dorado Hills. What is the county's involvement with continuous electric power availability and monthly costs to consumers?
So one of the things that we recently started at the county is the CCA process, which is customer choice aggregation, consumer choice aggregation, which looks at being able to secure the electrical energy source through a separate entity other than PG&E. The distribution of that power then would always come through the PG&E infrastructure, at least today, because they own the infrastructure. But we're talking to Pioneer Energy, Community Energy, about possibly annexing, joining their JPA, Joint Powers Agreement, for purposes of getting lower cost electrical supply. The numbers that they have been able to accrue is a savings of about 10% on your annual bill to every ratepayer that's in that CCA. And so we think that the forecast for the future is for that to continue and get better. With respect to PSPSs, that won't help. If you're talking about, what happens when you have high winds and those kinds of things, when you're talking about what happens when there's a shortage on the ISO grid to provide electrical energy to places like El Dorado Hill, no, we're still going to be subject to being shut down because of the PG&E infrastructure. So it doesn't help PSPS, and it doesn't help the rolling blackouts that we experienced this last summer. So it does help reduce the cost of electrical supply, but not the reliability, I'll call it, of the electrical supply. Because again, it's the PG&E infrastructure, transmission towers, transformers, all of that still under PG&E's control.
All right, so down to our last few questions.
Okay.
Thanks again, John, for answering all of these. Debbie Manning asks, can you share why county supervisor is a nonpartisan position? And please share if you have support from all political parties.
I believe that at the county level, there's a reason why all elected officials are nonpartisan. So whether you're talking about our sheriff, our auditor controller, our treasurer tax collector, a member of the board of supervisors, it's nonpartisan because it's supposed to be local community-based decisions in terms of who represents them. When you get to the state level and the federal level, we all recognize, I think there's a lot more partisanship that goes on there. But I think at the local level, it should remain nonpartisan because people ought to choose the person in those positions that they feel best represents them. So I do have very widespread support in my campaign. Probably the highest level of endorsement I have is through Assemblyman Kevin Kiley. I've established a relationship with Kevin, and he and I see eye to eye on an awful lot of things. The AB5 effort that he's doing to try to bring back the ability for independent contractors in the state, all of his provisions. He's suing the governor to try to make sure that the COVID situation is not overstretched or overmanaged. So to the best of his ability, he's challenging what goes on at the state capitol. Unfortunately, he's not part of the majority at the state capitol. So it's a continuing struggle, but I very much appreciate what Kevin Kiley is doing. Second, probably in my supports is retired Sheriff John McGinnis. John and I have known one another for probably 25 or 30 years when John McGinnis was on the Cameron Park Community Services District, as I recall. And I was on the El Dorado Hills Fire Department. So we had a relationship we started back there. John decided to get into the law enforcement service a little bit more extensive and ended up being sheriff of Sacramento County for, 12 years or something. It was pretty long term. He's highly revered, highly respected. He has the radio program on a regular basis, which I try to listen to every time I can, because I believe his conservative values are pretty much dialed right in. And then the third endorsement I have is Shiva Frenson, in terms of who's basically termed out District 2 supervisor. District 2 and District 1 have a lot in common because District 2 has half the business park within its boundaries, and a lot of the residential housing, the Lennar homes and Blackstone and all those things, which we consider to be part of El Dorado Hills. So I still have a lot of relationships with people in those housing units and stuff. So District 2 and District 1 are probably the closest in relationships to District 1 because of the fact of there's common themes there: high density residential housing, the business park, et cetera. So having Shiva's endorsement, I think, is very, very important as well.
All right, so last one.
Yeah.
Do you believe in more training for county employees?
Yes, absolutely. My background at Aerojet was you have to do training in terms of being able to, number one, safety training. Make sure that the employees are understanding what their job responsibilities are. If you talk about PPE, personal protection equipment, PPE provisions need to be adhered to in certain types of situations. So that's very, very important. You start with safety. But beyond that, developmental needs and training to try to help people understand all of the tools and systems that are available to them. Technology is constantly advancing. The methods that we use to do things is always advancing. So I've been a long-term proponent of best practices. And to that end, I think what CSAC does is really, really great. They have an annual program they call the Challenge Awards, wherein they look for best practices across all 58 counties and then identify where they see those best practices. Last year, we were privileged to get 2 of those awards, major awards. One is with our sheriff's hot team, which was reviewed as being the model of what you do for homeless outreach activities and stuff. Very, very much, I think, represents what we mean in El Dorado County. How do you help others? And then the second one was with our hub program, our first 5, in terms of delivering services to the county library facilities, in terms of being able to understand the needs of kids, being able to deal with mental health assessments, needs programs, those kinds of things. So both of those received CSAC awards. And if you haven't viewed them, I'd encourage you to look at the video that really describes in about 3 minutes what those programs are all about. It's a tremendous tribute to El Dorado County and how we're changing things and making a difference. To be recognized as best practices amongst 58 counties is pretty significant. So, but I'm always looking at what other counties are doing. What are their best practices that we can possibly bring to El Dorado County?
All right, so that's all the questions. Normally we do a closing statement, but you've done a lot of talking over the last hour. So I'll let you decide if there's anything else you'd like to add, or what I would ask you to say though is one of the unfortunate things with a lot of people being able to come out to forums like this because of COVID concerns is, you know, you're not able to do the same kind of meet and greet that you normally would during a campaign.
Right.
So if folks are watching online and they want to get in touch with you, how can they do that best?
My website has a lot of information. So if you're just looking for information, that website is www.hidahl, Hidahl, the number 4, soup, SUPE.com. So that's the best way to get general information. But my email is also available at the Board of Supervisors is probably the best way to contact me. And that's John Hidahl. That's John Hidahl at edcgov.us. Actually, it's better to probably use the BOS one because that will come in through my assistant. So it's BOSONE at edcgov.us. That way my assistant will see the information as well, because we're a team. One of the things that I recognize is really, really necessary, maybe this is my closing statement, is that you can't do things by yourself. It really takes a team of dedicated people to look at things and to contribute towards solutions. So in El Dorado Hills, we've established a community council. It actually was established back in 1981, but I was one of the founding members. We've continued that. So our community council today consists of a series of volunteers who take leadership roles in various aspects of the needs of El Dorado Hills. So for instance, public safety is Deputy Chief Mike Lilienthal. He coordinates all of that. So he works with our law enforcement agents, the CHP, the sheriffs, to try to make sure that El Dorado Hills is represented. There's communication there. We have healthy communities. So we took the 5 strategic elements of the county, brought that to El Dorado Hills. I have a leader for each of those. We also have a communications piece of it. We have an area plan advisory committee piece of it. And I'm considering this year adding another membership to it, which would be basically a youth commissioner, someone from Oak Ridge High School that would be a senior that was not given the opportunity to be seated on the youth commission, because what I've found out in that area is they tend to like repetitive people who can serve for more than 1 year. So the seniors who might apply generally don't get an opportunity to serve on our youth commission. But I would like to invite a senior that applied in El Dorado Hills to be part of our community council, because I think that youth input is helpful and we don't have it right now. So they would represent Oak Ridge High School and telling us, you know, the things that are going on at Oak Ridge High School that are really important. They have a great program in their mental health area where they have prepared an app, and they're really trying to help the students who are struggling with things like suicidal tendencies to get help, to understand that there's people who care about them, and they you know, basically need to get assistance, professional assistance, to try to deal with whatever it is they're going through. COVID in itself has exacerbated that tremendously. So people are just you know, basically in a state of anxiety. They're in a state of distrust, and so those services are available. But that team, I think, is essential to really make sure that things work well within El Dorado Hills.
All right. Well, with that will conclude our forum. How about a great round of applause for John? That was a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for joining us. So as a reminder, this was our last Board of Supervisors candidate. Guys, we could, just for one more minute, this is our last Board of Supervisors Candidate Forum. We had one last week for District 2. You can find that on our Facebook page or on YouTube. Just search for Taxpayers Association of El Dorado County. We will have one more candidate forum next week. That'll be the rescheduled EID Division 3 candidate one. There's 3 candidates for that, so that'll be exciting. And so I'd encourage you to join us next week if you live in the Placerville area and are in EID Division 3. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and I should also mention we hope Supervisor Briggs as well. He had said he would be here this morning, but you know, sometimes things happen. So hopefully he's doing well. And with that, I'll go ahead and close the Facebook live stream for Taxpayers Association members on Zoom. We will have just a couple of really quick things. I don't anticipate any votes today, but we do want to hear about what's on the Board of Supervisors agenda tomorrow. So I will stop the live stream and we'll go ahead and do that.